I once was dead, and now I'm free. Once it was dark, but now the light is within me. If that is familiar, it's probably because you were here last Sunday. There's a little bit of a variation to the opening, to where I said, once I was blind and now I see. Once it was dark and now the light is within me. A little bit of a change as we continue on with the stories of Jesus' miracles. Blindness was last week. This week we have the story of Lazarus. Last week I told you the story of one particular man who was born in Istanbul, Turkey. You may remember Ezra Ramadan. Extraordinary story about how a young man who had never seen in his entire life was able to draw to scale and perception pictures with color that he had never seen before. It's truly a remarkable miracle. Today I'm going to bring you another story because I know how much you love to hear stories. This time, instead of going back to the 1950s, I'm going to take you to the year 2001. And I'm going to take you to Africa to learn about this one particular man whose name was Daniel Ekechukwu. Daniel Ekechukwu. It's a story of a minister of God who rose from the dead. It happened on a Friday morning, November 30th. Daniel and his wife Mika got into a terrible spat. It was really bad, says Mika. Daniel, in a rage, drove off to work at his church. I'm sorry, I had to laugh. He was driving enraged by the conversation. And throughout his visits and throughout his ministerial work, he is harboring ill will towards his wife. In fact, he's thinking about the conversation that's going to take place once he gets home. Maybe he felt he was going to set the record straight. Well, the Lord had different plans, and Daniel didn't make it home. As he was driving his car through this one Nigerian city named Onitsha, I think I'm pronouncing it right, he realized that he couldn't stop. Apparently there was a leak in his brake fluid. He kept tamping the brakes, and nothing was happening. Unfortunately for him, he was on a downward grade. And as he's going through the city, his speed accelerates. There's children, there's women, there's merchants. He didn't know what to do but to keep going forward. And the more he went straight, the faster he got. His car would hit head-on a stone pillar. There were many people around who witnessed the event. They ran to the car, women were wailing, men were fiercely trying to pry him out. The body was lifted. Pictures were taken. And he was taken to the nearest hospital. His wife, Mika, was notified and she rushed to the hospital. She met the doctor who was treating her husband's wounds, and he was in a very serious condition. She leaned over her husband, and all he kept saying was, "I'm sorry." And then he said, "Take me to our family doctor." She told the doctor on call, who was there, and he took her to the side and said, "Mrs. Ekechukwu, your husband's confused. He's been in a terrible accident. He doesn't know what he's saying. He's not in his right mind." And Mika pressed on to honor her husband's wish. And she said, no, my husband wants to be taken to our family doctor. The report was filed, the release was signed, and they loaded her husband into the ambulance. She got in, and off they went to their family doctor. They arrived, and when they did, their family doctor, I keep turning because I know it's hard to pronounce. His name was Josh Anabunwa. Josh Anabunwa. And Dr. Anabunwa looked him over and noticed there was no respiratory signs. There was no heartbeat. He opened his eyelids. He did everything, and he knew what he was looking at, a dead man. He pulled Mika to his side and said, I am so heartbroken and so sorry, but he must have died on the way over. There's nothing more I can do for him. She, of course, was very saddened. Family came to her side and they consoled her as best as they could. The mortician, the coroner, all the witnesses came by, and the reports were signed and the pronouncement of his death at that hour, November the 30th. It was somewhere around 6:30, 7 p.m. Now, they took his body and they put him in an open-aired room where there were two other bodies. And he stayed there until they could do the embalming. They didn't do embalmings right away. Later that night, the mortician, who was housed right beside his own place, he woke up in the middle of the night and he heard music that he's never heard before. It startled him. And he went to that room, and there was nothing but the bodies. This disturbed him. He didn't touch the body the next day. And when he went to bed that night, once more he was awakened to this music he had never heard before. Now the next morning, he goes to the family doctor and he insists that they take the body away. He wants nothing to do. Mika was notified. All the people of their church were notified. And they came with a casket. The security guards wouldn't let them in. They feared that they had a bomb in the casket. Reluctantly, they signed away and released the body to them for a proper burial. They took him to the basement of the Grace Community Church that was there in that city. And people came and they laid a vigil. They prayed for him. They touched him. And I know this because I saw the video to it. They put their hands on him. Mika whispered in his ear. And then he coughed. His chest rose. He began to breathe. Amazing story. They massaged his hands, his peripherals, his feet, everything they could. And it shows this man who was emaciated. I mean, he was thin as a rail. He had gone through death. And he stood up, and you could tell he was completely in a different place. They took him and they sat him down, and he said, why is there singing? Why is there praying? Why are all these people around me? I was driving my car, and now here I am. He had no concept of the time. Now later, they would nurse him back to health, still alive today, and he would tell of apparitions and dreams that he was visited by an angel. He visited heaven. He visited hell. He saw and heard music and buildings that were not made of material construction. The music he heard was coming from the flowers. It was surreal. As fascinating as a miracle story as it is, amazingly, it never hit any of the major news networks. Nope, it didn't make a New York Times. Didn't get on Fox News. It didn't get on any of that. In fact, the YouTube video alone only has 25,000 hits. And there were many of the grassroots, naysayers, and even atheist communities that went to compare the story of all the individual witnesses. And when it was over and said and done, they all said there's no valid reason to say that this story didn't happen. What do you believe? Does Jesus have the power to raise the dead to life? Now this story, it hits home a little closer. We're talking it's in our century. But as I began to do my research, there's other accounts of other occurrences. Some were hoax, some were not. And it makes us wonder when we read the story of Lazarus that happened so many years ago, where are we placing that in our lives? Is it just another story? Is it folklore? Or did it truly happen the way that we heard it this morning? And what about that story in Ezekiel? Oh my word. This battleground that took, this battle that took place years ago, and the prophet Ezekiel is seeing bones rising up and sinew grafting onto the bones and human form, and all of a sudden all these people appear. Is that a dream? Is that an apparition? Or is it truth? That again, God can raise the dead to life. The stories that we hear this morning are real. And they're real because, once again, it's done for our sake, that we may hear and that we may know that the resurrection occurs. We just have to be looking for it. It's not just set in history. It's not just an occurrence where Jesus died and rose again. It's the power that he conveyed and presented to our humanity. It's not the focus on the flesh that he's concerned. It's the focus on the power and strength of the Spirit, as we hear from St. Paul in the reading to the Romans. This is the sober reminder that at one time we were dead, but now we're free. When we come here and when we worship, we're worshiping the one who has the power to raise the dead to life. He has the power to raise you out of your conscious sin or subconscious, out of your own flesh into the Spirit of God. And with that, you can do all things. I love it. He rose Lazarus, and he told the people about it. And he went into a very hostile environment. He went to a place, returning, where they would kill him. And even Thomas said, let's go back with him and die with him. He knew that there'd be sudden death and peril. Sometimes we find that there's a risk in this good news that we proclaim. And sometimes there's great persecution. But we must believe that God has the power to do what many consider impossible. Today we're reminded, much like Ezekiel, much like Lazarus, much like Daniel. And we join them when we hear those words, once we were dead and now we're free. Once it was dark. Through the power of Christ, his light is still within me. May you have the boldness to proclaim the mystery of God and to tell others that he has the power to raise the dead to life.